There's been a lot of news around this particular piece of legislation, and I know it's an issue that we've talked about personally, Mr. Chairman, that has to get resolved in the state of Idaho. I know it can be contentious and difficult when you're working with these type of issues, but I appreciate the committee's indulgence on a difficult and sensitive topic. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, today I'm going to present you with House Bill 377. And really, Mr. Chairman, it's a policy decision for this committee to determine whether they would like to change the current statute in the state of Idaho with regarding the solicitation of a prostitute. As this committee is probably well aware, it's a misdemeanor on the first offense if you're caught and prosecuted. It's a misdemeanor on the second offense if you're caught and prosecuted. And it is a felony on the third offense if you're caught and prosecuted. This is a policy decision for this committee. Do we want to make it a felony on the first offense? I have done a little bit of research on the issue, Mr. Chairman, and I can tell you that should this committee decide to move forward with this policy decision, this would be landmark. You guys would be on the forefront of combating human trafficking, and more specifically sex trafficking, not just in Idaho, but in the entire United States. There is no other state in the United States that makes it a felony to solicit prostitution on the first offense. But I think that should we enact this legislation, should we move this legislation forward, Idaho will be sending a very clear and a very strong message that sex solicitation, sex trafficking, and human trafficking is not welcome in the state of Idaho. Mr. Chairman, I'm sure that looking at this committee, you've got at least 4 attorneys on the committee, so I'm sure that they understand language better than I. But I would be happy to stand for any questions. I'll close my remarks there until we close. I do have some folks that are here that have been in this industry, that have been trafficked, that would like to testify today. I have advised them how the committee process works. Some questions they may not be able to answer based on litigation. They will use their initials for their names today because the sensitivity surrounding this issue. The individuals that traffic them are still trying to find them. And should they find them, they want to entrap them, enslave them, and put them back in this industry again. The fight to stop slavery in this country and in the world was a long and arduous fight. And I hope that the fight to stop sex slavery and human trafficking is not a long and arduous fight. I hope that we can find the courage and the strength today to do the right thing. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd stand for any questions.
Thank you, Representative Crane. Do you want to ask questions now, or wait, Representative Malik, you have a question now?
Yeah, just a little.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Crane, thank you. Just, this is a patronizing a prostitute statute. Is there a tie between patronizing a prostitute and the sex trafficking? I understand the need to fight against sex trafficking, but I'm just trying to build the connection between prostitute and someone who is the victim of sex trafficking.
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Malik. Yeah, there is a link. The difference is, and we try to put a glossy picture on prostitution. I've not seen the movie, but I did talk to an individual that had seen the movie, Pretty Woman. That's what we try to view prostitution like in our culture today. It's Julia Roberts and it's Robert Gere and it's glamorous and it's this girl that falls madly in love with a lonely businessman and they fall in love and everything's wonderful. These are girls that are recruited, that are targeted, that are abused, that are drugged, and that are enslaved and forced against their will to do things that you and I cannot even imagine. So I would argue that, yes, there is a link between prostitution and between sex slavery. That line is becoming more and more blurred, and those two are coming together.
Representative Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Crane, that nexus, is it absolute? Are 100% of those who are charged under 1856-14 truly patronizing somebody who's been trafficked?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Cheney. No. But I think it's a policy question for the state of Idaho. I think it's a policy question for you, and I think it's one that you can ask with your constituents. If you'll look at Article 3, Section 24 of the Constitution, it says that this body, the Idaho legislature, is charged with temperance and morality and purity of the home. Is prostitution something that we should be promoting in the state of Idaho? I would argue constitutionally, no, it's not. I think you would be hard-pressed to represent to your constituents with a straight face that when you stand swore to uphold the Constitution of the state of Idaho, and it talks about purity in the home, that allowing prostitution to exist is good for the homes and the families in the state of Idaho.
Follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Crane, I understand your policy argument and your the position that you've articulated, but what I'm trying to get to are the actual practical effects of the act if we were to adopt this, and not necessarily what I may or may not say in a campaign. And when we talk about the practical effects of this act, what I'm trying to find out is what are the unintended consequences. There are a lot of things that would improve the purity of the home. Eliminating internet access in the state might be one of those things, but we don't. And so we have to make decisions, and we have to allow people to be responsible for their own actions. So as part of that, I'm trying to find out under what circumstances might this act overreach and affect those persons who are in no way in a nexus with human trafficking.
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Cheney, I think I said in the hearing, on the print hearing, you can go to Caldwell High School if you'd like. Talk to the senior class. Ask the girls in that senior class, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I will bet you a dinner at your favorite restaurant that not a single girl there is going to say, you know, Representative Cheney, my desire is to be a prostitute when I grow up. The problem with this industry is that these individuals are forced into something against their own will. Now, not all prostitutes are practicing against their will, but I would argue that a lot of them are.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Crane, with regard to this particular effort, I guess, am I correct in assuming that you're not satisfied with the enforcement of this particular statute in Idaho? I mean, tell me a little bit, help me understand what your motivation is for this.
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative McDonald. The definition in my world, the definition of insanity is to repeat the same thing over and over and expect a different result. We have a problem. And quite frankly, Representative McDonald, until December of this year, I had no idea how vast the problem was in the state of Idaho. And it's not just Idaho's problem, it's a countrywide, it's a worldwide problem. The estimates are over 1 million children a year are being abused worldwide. In every state, all 50 states that I researched, we punish the prostitute, we punish the pimp, and we go lightly on the John. Yesterday was an article written in the Indiana Star by a gentleman who had spent over a year undercover, his name is Tim Swearens, looking at the sex industry in the United States and in the world. And if it's okay, Mr. Chairman, I could read some of that, or if it's too much, I could summarize for the committee. Your choice, Mr. Chairman.
If it's not too long, you could quote some pertinent paragraphs.
Okay. What he says, the synopsis of it, I'll just give you the synopsis is, we punish the pimp, we punish the girl, we don't punish the buyer. Common theme everywhere we go. And so to say, hey, it's a misdemeanor on your first offense, just don't do that again. Misdemeanor on your second offense, just don't do that again. It's not working. It's a policy that's not working. And so I think in order to send a strong message to these individuals that this has got to stop, this is unacceptable. We already have said in Idaho law, it's a felony, let's bump that up. That's what I'm advocating for. That answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you. You're probably accurate in stating that that there are over 1 million children abused, but there's a difference between abuse and prostitution. And what I'm asking you here is, in your mind, are the law enforcement agencies in Idaho enforcing this effectively? That's the first part. The second one is, are the courts in Idaho effectively sentencing these violators?
Representative Crane.
Mr. Chairman and Representative McDonald, I tread into that arena lightly. I'm going to try to be careful how I answer your question. They're doing okay, but there is a lot of room for improvement. In meeting with law enforcement, they will tell you they don't have the resources. So they're doing okay. They're not doing as good as they could.
Representative Nate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Crane. Stepping this up to the next level, the felony level, can you give me a summary, as well as you know it, of what kind of rights or privileges a person loses when they're convicted of a felony in Idaho?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Nate. I'm not an attorney, and I definitely don't sit on this committee, but I believe they lose their right to vote, and they also lose their right to possess a firearm. Outside of that, I don't know.
Follow up.
Yes, please. Mr. Chairman, Representative Crane, I understand stepping up the charge on this is meant to have a deterrent effect. But in stepping it up so much, there may be an unintended consequence of fewer prosecutions and convictions because the penalty is so high. If you get where I'm going, that maybe there is less of a willingness to prosecute fully, for this violation, if the penalty is so high that maybe sympathetic prosecutors or judges are a little less willing to apply the to apply the conviction. Is there any thought of, I understand increasing the penalty, any thought of going from 3 strikes, not all the way down to 1 strike, but perhaps 2 strikes instead?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Nate. I'll answer that question 2 ways. First of all, I respect the will of the committee, and I respect the individuals that sit inside this room or sitting behind those desks. It's a tough decision. However, so I'll respect whatever decision the committee makes. But also, the prosecutor is not forced to charge them with a felony. I think you heard in the RS hearing with Representative Gannon, him talking about prosecutorial discretion. And I've heard over and over in my 12 years in this business that we like to give that discretionary ability to the prosecutors and to the judges. And we elect good prosecutors and we elect good judges to use reasonable judgment when they're enacting penalties. But to answer your question, I will respect the will of the committee.
Representative Gannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Crane. What is the present maximum penalty for a misdemeanor violation of the statute now?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Representative Gannon, I don't know.
Representative Malik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this, you and I had a conversation about this, Representative, and it was not what I was expecting. And it seems to be more of an anti-prostitution bill, which I'm not opposed to. I guess my question is does it have, do we have examples of other states maybe where this has resulted in a decrease in prostitution? And if I can expound on that question for just a second, thank you, Mr. Chairman, I do think that there is value in making a strong policy statement, and I think that in places where we do choose to do that we can have a deterrent effect on the activity. I'm just wondering, in the case of prostitution, whether that is the case.
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Malik. There is no state in the union that has a felony provision for the purchaser. We would be first in the country to do that. And I would like to see Idaho be the leader. I really would. I want to send a message that this is not tolerated in the state of Idaho. So with respect to statistics, no, not in the United States. But in Scandinavia, yes, most certainly. They have done that. And you will hear someone testify today that it has been tried in other countries, not in the United States, and they have seen great success. In fact, they have mandatory minimums on prison sentencing for the purchaser. You have to go after the buyer.
Representative Kirby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crane, I would like to get at a little bit Representative Cheney's issue, the nexus between prostitution and trafficking. Excuse me if I'm a little bit naive on this issue. I don't know how good a question this is, but I'm just wondering if a buyer, a client, walks into some sort of a place of prostitution, does that client know whether or not the girl is doing this of her own volition or if she's part of some kind of a trafficking operation?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Kirby. Sometimes, no, they don't. Oftentimes, no, they don't. The transactions that you see now, the prostitution business, as you and I possibly understand it, is no longer a girl in fishnet stockings and a miniskirt with a halter top on and high heels. These are individuals that are running around, teenagers that are actually going to our schools and being trafficked after they get home from school. They're wearing normal clothes. They look like normal kids. It's happening at an alarming rate. It's staggering what's happening. So no, oftentimes that they don't know. The other thing that's staggering, and it was in this report that was in the Indiana Star, is how many men, when they realize, they walk into the room and realize the girl is underage, continue to go ahead and purchase the service. Out of 150 men, one girl testifies in his story. She says, out of 150 men that I saw, only two in one month, only two of those men walked out of the room when they acknowledged I was underage. 148 men decided to go ahead and purchase that young lady.
Representative Zollinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Crane. This kind of goes along with the nexus questions that Representative Cheney was asking. But I first, can you give me any data on how many people were first charged with this crime in the state of Idaho, and then how many convictions we had, maybe some data along those lines?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Zollinger. Alluding to Representative McDonald's question, I want to be very sensitive and careful. I'm not here to paint law enforcement or our prosecutors in a negative light. I want to be very clear about that. But the evidence of convictions is very slim.
Follow up?
On that, are you aware of any statute that would, I haven't looked, this thought just came to me, that would treat these Johns, I guess, these patrons differently if the crime involved a minor? Is there any statute that deals with that differently, or is it the same punishment?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Zollinger. In the state of Idaho, yes, it is a felony with a minor.
Representative Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And really, Representative Zollinger took my question. I was after the data myself, and so I kind of had imagined the answer. So in absence of really any data to say whether this is an issue or not, I do want to correct. Did I understand you correctly when you had said that Idaho does not punish the John? Or are you specifying that we don't do it the first time, or are you saying we don't ever do it?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Perry. I outlined for you at the start of my testimony that the current provision is misdemeanor if you're convicted on the first offense, misdemeanor on the second offense, felony on the third offense. Currently, we're not doing a good job of prosecuting those individuals. State of Illinois has a sheriff that has a project going where they do, across the country, they do stings. Idaho doesn't participate in the stings. So again, I'm sensitive to law enforcement. I understand the lack of resources. I understand the challenges that the judicial system faces. So I want to be careful there, but we have some work to do in that area.
Follow up?
Follow-up. And I think, and I'm just going to kind of challenge you a little bit here, but because I've been on this committee for quite some time, and we're well aware of how prosecution works in here, and they are diligent in their job. So I'm not really sure that it's that they don't prosecute as much as perhaps we're not getting charges to begin with. But Idaho has one of the largest incarceration rates per capita in the nation because we actually have very tough laws overall. And when we do incarcerate people, we actually tend to do it for a much longer lengths of time than most other states in the nation. And so I'm wondering, when you put this all together, did you speak to the courts at all?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Perry. The prosecutor can only bring charges against an individual that's been arrested. So the point that I've tried to make and delicately danced around is if they don't get the individuals in front of them, they can't prosecute them. That's the problem. Now, did I speak to the courts? No. When I sat with Dawn and another individual in my office in December, I didn't feel the need to speak with the courts when there is a serious moral issue in our state. I knew I had to act. I didn't have to go and talk to the courts. I knew that something had to be done. And so we went about the business of drafting legislation to make sure that we are sending a message to these individuals that our girls are not for sale.
Follow-up? I did have a follow-up. One other question, and we'll just pivot here to a different issue. But not only are you changing this to first offense to a felony, but you are seeking to actually put in this definition of sexual contact that was not here before. I looked up that definition in the other statute there. And one thing that I'm curious about, because we're dealing with this, if we're dealing about the safety of the girls also, I'm just curious why that definition does not also include battery, abuse of any kind. It doesn't include any of that in your definition.
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Perry. We kept it sexual in nature only. There are other parts of the statute that address that, and also there is a rewrite coming of the trafficking statute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Crane. You said that we're not getting the cases in front of the courts to prosecute to begin with. How would the change in classification improve that?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Cheney. I think when you elevate an issue by increasing its penalty, there is obviously more awareness around the issue. People take it more seriously. I don't think we're taking this issue seriously, and that's the intent, is to send a serious and strong message.
Follow-up?
You mentioned the prosecutorial discretion in pursuing the prosecution, but there's only going to be one, under this bill, there would only be one classification for solicitation. So are you saying that if a prosecutor were to exercise his or her discretion, they would have to reduce it to a non-sexual crime in order to charge them as a misdemeanor as part of a plea?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative. No, I did not say that.
Follow-up?
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Crane. So what would they reduce it to if they were to plead this out?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Cheney. I believe that the prosecutor has a full bevy of items that they can utilize in their possession.
Follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to move just briefly to your fiscal note, Representative Crane. It says that there's no impact to the general fund because this is administered by local jurisdictions. However, by definition, what you're doing is taking it out of the county jails and moving it into the state penal system. So how does that not impact the general fund?
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Cheney. I've tried to be very careful, and the committee continues to press. But if you're not prosecuting for this in the first place, there's probably not going to be an impact. This is, as I told you in the print hearing, this is step one of several bills that are coming forward to address the issue. We've got a systemic problem in the state. This issue is being overlooked. Just changing it to a felony doesn't immediately mean that your prisons are going to be full of individuals who are engaged in this activity. But I think it signals to law enforcement the seriousness of this issue.
Representative McCrosty.
Mr. Chairman, in listening to the conversation, I would just like to ask if it please the chair, and throughout the course of the testimony, and as we're addressing this particular subject, the phrase "Johns" has come up on multiple times, and I say it a bit in jest and a bit in serious. If we could avoid using that as a term, I personally would feel better.
Fair comment, Representative McCrosty. Representative Hanks, and I'm thinking at this point that we've got a number of questions of the sponsor. I think we've had enough questioning so that we can maybe let the witnesses testify, and then we can come back and follow up with some questions of Representative Crane. But I'd like to be able to have the witnesses testify, and a number of them have come from out of town, I think. So with that, we'll give you a reprieve here.
Mr. Chairman,
And,
thank you. I was just getting warmed up.
Okay. And, well, don't get too comfortable because the lights are still on. But anyway, just feel free to turn your lights on after we're done. Do you have an emergency there, Representative? Okay. Okay. We do have a number of people signed up, and there is one comment that we received via email. It's in your packet, and we've provided Representative Crane with that. This is one that is opposed to legislation and does point out an item that Representative Crane did point out, and that would be that Idaho would be the first one to make this a felony. But Representative Crane has a copy of that. And as you come up, you probably saw, just identify yourself, and if you're uncomfortable with your, because of legal situations, just give us your initials or whatever you need to. If you can, just two things. Focus your testimony on the particular bill and how what you have to say relates to this bill of increasing the penalty of prostitution to a felony. And secondly, since we have a number of people, if you can kind of keep it to 3 or 4 minutes, I'm not going to be iron-handed about it, at least yet, but just kind of keep that in your thoughts as you share your testimony. So first of all, we have, and I'm sorry if I don't get these all right, Celia Snelling. Is that right? Would you like to testify? No? Yes, you would like to well, come forward, yes. Come up to the podium and then just state your name and share what you would like to share.
My name is Celia Snelling. Just briefly, I'm a part of Operation Underground Railroad. It's a sex trafficking organization started by Tim Ballard. He's been all over the world rescuing people from sex trafficking. Briefly, sex trafficking is, sorry, I was not prepared to speak. So sex trafficking is, as you guys have, some of you have just discovered, can be all the way from prostitution down to actually kidnapping people. So it is not just, as he described something on Pretty Women, it goes much broader than that. So as you'll hear in some of these testimonies, it's just that. It can go way above and beyond. I had the opportunity to meet Don through a movie that we brought to Edwards called The Abolitionist. If you have more questions, please read that, or please watch that movie and go to Operation Underground Railroad. It'll give you a good description on exactly what sex trafficking entails and just the different types of sex trafficking that there are. This bill is very, very important, very near and dear to all of us. I know that a concern is that we'll be the first state that does this, but I don't see anything wrong with that. We have a chance to make headway and to make history, which is something pretty amazing. And I don't see that. I can see that as scary, but at the same time, that's a pretty amazing opportunity that we have here in the state of Idaho. Sex trafficking is real. It is happening here in the state of Idaho, whether you want to believe it or not. And so I know I had probably a ton more to say, but just listen to what these people have to say, and please open up your hearts. Please open up your minds and realize that this is a real problem. Picture your children, your grandchildren. If this were to happen to them, what would you want that person that just did that to your child, to your grandchild? People can steal things, and they get way more than just a slap on the wrist for it. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Snelling? There is one. Representative Kirby.
Oh, okay, Mr. Chairman, ma'am. So knowing the industry like you do, so the changing this from a misdemeanor to a felony, I mean, knowing these men, I mean, is this going to change behaviors, or how do you see this playing out if we pass this law?
Ms.
I don't-
Snelling.
Thank you. I don't feel like you can change the behavior of somebody. I have 6 kids that I've been trying to change their behavior for a long time, and that is not going to work. I feel like we can set up things to try to correct behavior, but you all know way better than I do. You know our court system, you know our judicial system, you know our prison system better than I do. It's not going to change a behavior, but it is going to put those people away. I don't think we're trying to change behavior. I think we're trying to give people a punishment for what they've done and protect girls and boys. This doesn't just happen to females, this happens to boys as well. We're trying to protect those people that it is done to, and we're trying to punish, essentially. Punish is probably a bad word, but we're trying to put those people behind bars. Whatever the judge decides to do, we're trying to put those people where they belong so that they can't offend again, so that they can't do it to somebody else. They will offend again, they will do it again, without a doubt. It's the 3rd highest money-making industry in the world. It is $1 billion industry, sex trafficking is. Those are statistics that you cannot ignore. 3rd highest money-making industry in the world. Billion dollar industry. It is here, it is real. So do I feel like they're gonna change their behavior? No. But if you put them behind bars, or if you instill a system, you will be able to make it so that they cannot repeat again. That I strongly feel.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Thank you. Bree Gager? Did I get that right?
Yes, Bree Gager.
Okay, welcome. If you could just state your name. Oh, you
My
did.
name-
So
My name
that's
is Bree
good.
Gager, and I've worked with Inside Out Cares for about 2 years. I've had the privilege and honor to become a therapeutic foster mom who has had the honor to have girls who have been trafficked and come and live with me. And I don't want to repeat everything that has been said, but I do want to emphasize how important it is to change the law. Right now, the problem that we're having is with the people who actually are purchasing the girls. The demand is what is the problem. And so I really feel that this is going to make a difference on the decrease of what is happening. We need to target the demand.
Questions? Thank you.
Thanks.
Mike Maglish? Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If you could state your name again.
Yeah, my name is Mike Maglish from Meridian. I am the CEO of Inside Out. We are an anti-human trafficking organization, nonprofit here in the state of Idaho. And we work with minors who have been trafficked. And The reality is, in some of the conversations as we hear them, February 27th, Donald Trump called human trafficking a national crisis. So if you're not aware of that, our president has referred to human trafficking as a national crisis, and he has vowed to put the full weight of the government behind this issue. There's been an 800% increase in online sex trafficking in the last 5 years. There are no houses of prostitution, as we refer to in our laws. It's online. Children are being found. They are being picked off. 68% of teen girls, last statistic I heard, is asked to send a nude photo. It is adults also who are asking these girls to do this. It is easier now than ever for adults to get their hands on children. The reality is sex trafficking, the average traffic victim gets started between the ages of 12 and 14, coerced. This is not simply an issue to be talked about in terms of adults making consensual decisions. This is a systemic reality. Prostitution is a systemic reality directly tied to human trafficking. You will be hearing testimony from survivors who we work with Inside Out, who have firsthand experience, who have been sold. And you'll be able to hear from them. The reality is Shared Hope International has graded all of our states in our human trafficking awareness and response, and Shared Hope International gave Idaho in 2014 an F grade. It meant that human trafficking was happening, but we really didn't know what it was. We couldn't really articulate it or what to do once we found a trafficked survivor, or the laws in place also were an issue. Shared Hope International has expressed their gratitude for us wanting to push forward with this law. And here's why. It is all about demand. If not the John, the purchaser, if the purchaser knows that Idaho means business, our survivors will know they live in a state that cares and is doing everything that it possibly can. And that really is the issue. Where is our bar? Where is our bar for this issue? And that bar needs to be set high. We have an opportunity to tell our president and to tell our country that Idaho means business. And I'm thankful for that.
Thank you. Questions? Representative Zollinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if I've seen debate coming into a committee meeting as much as I've seen on this bill today. I sense a passion, and every member on this committee understands the severity of this problem and want to take it serious. The question I have, you mentioned we had an F grade. Can you tell, and no state is doing this proposal now, but can you tell me why the F grade? What are we not doing that other states are doing to deserve an F grade?
Well, let me
Mr.
back
Maglish.
up. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Permission to respond. So let me back up. In 2014, we received that grade, and Inside Out as an organization recognized that to be a massive issue, and we've been working on that. In 2016, we got a C. Okay, there's a number of issues, including direct services for trafficked victims, direct services for trafficked minors, including our laws. Okay, so it really does cover a lot of different aspects, not just one or two. It's a systemic issue, and so it's the systemic issue that we've been working on and dealing with. Laws happen to be part of that. So.
Well, Representative Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was actually quite simple, but thank you for saying that we have been making progress, because this committee has worked on human trafficking quite often in the time that I've been here, and they continue to do that. So thank you. But I had a very simple question. Could you give me your website address? Because I tried to Google to see really what your organization is all about, and I get something that obviously is not relative.
Yeah. It's InsideOutCares.org.
InsideOutCares.org. Thank you very much.
InsideOutCares.org. You're welcome.
Thank you. Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, sir. Could you give me an idea of how many cases you handle like this in a year?
Mr. Maglish.
Yeah, I can tell you that Inside Out currently works with over 40 girls who are minors, who've been brought out of human sex trafficking, some who have been high risk of human sex trafficking in their situation. We have developed through Path Idaho, for the first time in the state of Idaho, now we have designated beds for trafficked minors that we're able to take these girls and care for them appropriately. The reality is, for every one girl you find, they say there's 10 that you have not found. And so we have quite an issue on our hands. It's a lot more massive than we ever realized. And big issue is there's not a physical place to go to. It's all online there, and it's happening at a very high clip. And we're just at the cusp of the issue. So the numbers aren't really there yet. We're still in the midst of that.
Follow up, Mr. Chair. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, sir, by doing this may be one thing that we can do to try to affect this issue. But we've got right now a fair amount of police officers out there on the street. Now, what could they do to affect this issue and to try to clean this mess up if
Mr.
that's at
Maglish.
all possible?
Well, this is in my personal opinion. From the detectives and the police officers we work with, they are doing a good job of doing everything they can within what they have, the resources available to them. If we want to really hit this issue, it's an online issue. It really is. By the time they track down the traffickers, if somebody is being solicited, it's pinging all over the country. Okay, these guys are hiding. In order to get them, they always seem to be 2 to 3 steps behind, but they're doing the best job they can. In my opinion, it's a resource issue for our officers. It's what our state determines needs to happen in order to find these guys. You're not just going to walk into a building and find a house of prostitution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Representative Ehart.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Sorry, I was just contemplating if Idaho receives an F grade or a C grade, who's doing it right? What states, maybe we should be looking to those states also right now. Who's getting an A?
Mr. Maglish.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. To my best of my knowledge, I'd have to defer this question to our Director of Advocacy, which is Don here. But we have a number of states that are actually now coming to us because this designated beds for trafficked minors is a major issue in our entire country. There are very few designated beds in our country. We're just now starting to realize the magnitude of the problem. And so we have states such as Tennessee and New Orleans. We are now talking to Oregon and Washington about how to provide for these survivors of human sex trafficking who are minors. And so I can speak specifically for Idaho and what's happening here in Idaho, but I'm not an expert on what's happening in our other states at this point regarding that. So thank you.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. No, thank you. I appreciate that because I don't think there's a single person here who's in favor of any of this, and probably most of us may not even know anyone personally who's been involved. But I will say this, that context is everything, and to understand that which you're proposing and the direction which we go. So, to have an F grade a C grade in relation to the other states and who's doing what actually may be of importance in moving forward and trying to make the decision that we need to make.
So along with that, Shared Hope
Mr.
International,
Maglish.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. Along with that, Shared Hope International did say to us, good job for wanting to push forward with this legislation. So,
Okay. Representative Gannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering, we've talked about a systemic problem, and the buyer now is subject to a misdemeanor, which I assume would be the penalty would at least be 6 months in jail and $1,000 fine. It might be a little different because I think it varies different statutes. So I'm just wondering how many of these cases you've referred to the prosecutors, which prosecutors, and what has been the result?
Mr. Maglish.
yes. So we deal on the advocacy side on providing for and helping these girls. We do speak to prosecutors. I do not feel like speaking about these cases and these issues. We deal with minors, and so the reality is, my wife also, Dawn, the director of advocacy, would be the one to speak to if you guys would like to find out more about some of those things that are happening. We are dealing with active cases right now. So.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So have you actually referred a case yourself to a prosecuting attorney?
Mr. Maglish.
So we have referred cases to detectives, and to the detectives, and the detectives go from there.
Representative Gannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And how many cases have you referred to detectives, and how many of those cases ended up being prosecutions of buyers?
Mr. Maglish.
Yes, so that is a question that I will defer to our Director of Advocacy, who oversees all of that, Dawn. She'd be much more equipped to answer that question for you.
Representative Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And I'm sorry, sir, would you repeat your name for me?
Yeah, it's Michael Maglish.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Maglish. My question is this to you, as I listen to what you're saying, and again, I mean, we are all clearly aware of the horrors of human trafficking. So in that, we align with you, and we want everyone here to know that. But my question is this. Idaho has an Internet Crimes Against Children task force that actually works this type of issue, because over and over we're hearing we're not having the houses anymore, it's very much online. And that task force works with our law enforcement across the state. And yet we're hearing resource problems, and we're hearing these types of things, which I would agree. So my question to you is, have you guys reached out to law enforcement, this task force? Have you all come together and decided really what is the best way to address this issue here in the state?
Mr. Maglish.
Yeah, great question. What I can say to that is yes, we have. We've spoken to law enforcement. We have spoken to the Idaho Internet Crimes Against Children Coalition. We have worked with them on a number of different ways and issues. The reality is that there is going to be a variance of understanding of when it comes to our laws and different things like that. We are convicted as individuals and organization working with our survivors, the girls who are in our program, that the purchasers are not being held accountable in a way. And these are not just from my words. These are from the words that we hear all the time from the girls in our program and from the survivors we work with. Why isn't anything really happening to the people who actually purchased and did this? What we do hear from our detectives and from the Idaho Internet Crimes Against Children Coalition is they have their hands full. That's what I can say.
Follow-up?
Follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. One follow-up. I know there's other lights. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I guess thank you, because I would imagine it's a resource issue, and it's probably got to be a coordinated effort to actually tackle this. So on this particular bill, and I ask because I don't see the representation in the room. On this particular bill, did you share this particular bill with them, and did they give you any feedback on that?
Mr. Maglish.
So I have not personally spoken to them on that, on this particular bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Daley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Maglish. I guess my question relates to, I think you've gotten the impression that everybody is supportive of having something done about the issue that's out there. But I guess the question to you is, with Shared Hope International, back to what some other questions have been asked, is, in the analysis, is this the best first step? Because we do need to do something, but incrementally doing something that actually has substance and moves us forward. I guess that's my question. And experience from other states, other countries, et cetera, can we build on something there with an incremental approach that maximizes what we do as we go through that?
Mr. Maglish.
You are going to hear testimony today regarding legislation in other countries and other places. I would encourage you to call Shared Hope International and to talk to them directly about what they feel about that. You're going to hear from us. They are the experts on the national level, and I would encourage you to call them and ask them their views on our laws and what we should or should not do. I personally believe this would be a fantastic first step.
Representative Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Maglish. Thank you for one, raising the awareness around this issue like everybody else on the committee. we do recognize that something needs to be done. I think the biggest concern overall is that we'll do something in the name of doing something and that it won't actually make a difference, but we'll tell ourselves we did and that the right thing won't happen because of that. To that point, you've shared a lot about underage children being trafficked and the work of your organization in helping them rehabilitate. My question is this: it seems as though, and I recognize that people of age, past the age of majority, can be trafficked as well. But you talk about the children, but that doesn't have a nexus with this bill. I don't know a single prosecutor in the state of Idaho that if they caught somebody having sexual contact with a minor in a prostitution situation would charge them with misdemeanor solicitation. And so under Idaho law, there's already life imprisonment for sexual contact with a minor. There's already life imprisonment for kidnapping. It seems as though the mechanisms are there, as Representative Crane mentioned, that the prosecuting attorneys have a full plethora of tools in their toolbox. It seems like the tools are there already without this particular change to address the ills that you've shared with us today.
Mr.
How would you
Magler,
respond to
do you have a question, a comment on that?
Well, I guess
Is that a?
that was
comment, or
that was a
yes?
rolling question / comment. How would you respond to that?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Maglish.
Yeah, so you're correct. I have articulated the issue that it is with minors, and all of our girls have a story. All the girls that they've been through have been able to articulate their story well with us. Here's what I know. I know that men are purchasing children for sex. Where are they right now? Are they being punished? Are they are they in prison? The reality is I understand, but it's not just. I bring that awareness of that to say this is how it starts. The average traffic victim getting started between the ages of 12 and 14. But the coercion starts before they're 18 and continues on after they're adults. It's not. I just bring that up to state what we do and how we do that. But the coercion, to make it, it's still slavery. It is still servitude, no matter what the age is. I've just articulated who we are and what we do and why it matters to us. So.
Follow up.
Just to put a finer point on it, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Maglish, so how is it that this legislation helps that situation?
Mr. Maglish.
Well, yes, because it sets a tone. It creates the denominator that is necessary for us to say we mean business. If the idea or the mindset is even there that purchasing a child is the same, in that Indy Star article, which I did read, 150 men walk in, find out this girl is underage, 2 walk out. So my point is, the reality of this is that when somebody is purchased for sex, okay, it is not simply an exchange. I would make the argument there are cases. There will be cases where there is no servitude that's involved, but that is not the standard, that is not the norm. Almost all cases involve some form of coercion and forced sexual acts.
Thank you. I think you've exhausted the questions. Thank you for your testimony. Michaela Shropshire. Welcome to the committee. If
How
you
are
could
you?
just state your name again. And
Michaela Shropshire. I'm from Payette, Idaho, and I'm 15 years old. Mr. Chairman, may I speak?
yes.
Okay. For me, it was a very hard time going through sex trafficking. I was only 13 when it first started. And I'd like for you all to understand that there cannot be prostitution if there's not buyers. I take prostitution very seriously. I was held against my will for a very long time. It all started with my mom's prostitution, and her pimp brought me into it. Seeing my mom go through something like that, you know, it didn't seem that wrong to me at the time, but then I got into it and I just wanted out. I wanted out so bad for so long. And it was so hard to speak up, you know, and try and tell someone. And just knowing that there's so many people out there that, you know when, like, many times I would tell a grown man my age, he was okay with it. He was fine with it. He didn't care. He just wanted the sex. And that just hurt me so bad, knowing that, you know, I had to come home and tell my father these things that happened to me. And if I can't, you know, your daughter came to you or your son came to you and told you these things that happened to them. I was severely abused, raped, mentally abused, everything you can imagine. And it was horrible for me. It's the worst experience I've ever had. I don't think without these women right here, I would have ever made it through this. They stood by my side through everything, and I'm so thankful that there are those kind of resources. You know, God showed me that. He showed me that I had a chance, you know, to change and to get help, the help I need. And there's so many more young women and women, grown women out there that need the help that states can provide for us. It takes a long time to get that help and that assurance that there's care and love for you. And I think that there definitely needs to be a change, not just with the pimps and the prostitutes, but the buyers as well. Because like I said, there wouldn't be prostitutes if there's no buyers.
Thank you for coming and your courage for standing up here and sharing that.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Bella Dolovici? How's that? Is that okay on the name? Dolovici? If you could state your name once more, yes.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Bella Dolovici and I'm from Nampa. My name is Bella. I'm a survivor of child sex trafficking. I had 4 ringleaders and 9 others that helped their ringleaders, including a family member. My day on average was seeing 5 Johns. It's horrifying when you add the numbers up. I was taken against my will for a long time. There was nice Johns and terrifying ones. Regardless of how they were to me, I didn't want to have sex with any of them. So that's being raped multiple times a day. Even though painful, I will tell you my worst experience with a John. It was an out call, which is where you go to them. He groomed me like a trafficker does. He had red wine, laid out, and was kind, and was dressed well in a suit. We got to the bedroom, and he choked me and tied me up in his bed. I went in and out of consciousness. He cut me with a knife up my abdomen many times, and he did many other horrible things to me that I felt for months, such as objects to penetrate and tear and slice areas of my body. I still to this day have nightmares from that night. Johns are just as dangerous as traffickers. Every John looked the other way when they found out I was underage. There was 5 of us in the ring, and the youngest was 9. And the Johns paid more for the 9-year-old. Johns knew I didn't want to have sex with them. I frequently was covered with bruises and many times cried during sex. So please make sure that they pay for buying me and other girls and boys for sex.
Thank you. And again, thank you for sharing that. Just one question. Were any of the traffickers that you were involved with ever arrested or?
Yes, they were.
And or prosecuted?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Good to hear. Thank you. Oh, Representative Perry.
You know what, thank you so much, really, for telling me that. And I just want to ask you one little question here. Could you tell me, is there something that somebody could have done to have found you sooner? I mean, how do you think we can find this?
Do you have an idea? Ms. Dolovici.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Perry, I think a larger task force monitoring the internet sites. I was on Backpage.com. My picture was clearly out there. I didn't look like an adult. So I think a larger task force would have been, someone could have found me sooner. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amanda Forrest.
Good
Welcome.
afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Excuse me.
Could you state your name, please?
My name's Amanda Forrest.
Even though I said it, I need to have you say it.
I know, I'm like, ooh, that's me. Mr. Chairman and all of the representatives present here today, it is my testimony that after living through and recovering from being a sex trafficking survivor, hearing and reading about countless other survivors' stories of demoralizing and inhumane and violent acts and threats of acts bestowed upon them and others, the data supporting what we already knew, my position remains unchanged. To end sex trafficking, we must end the demand. The risk must outweigh the gain. The Scandinavian human rights lawyers released an article on 8/25/15 clearly stating that implementing mandatory prison time of all sex purchasers, and I quote, according to the evaluation of the legislation on the purchase of sexual service made a couple years ago by the Swedish government, SOU 210-49, street prostitution in Sweden has been reduced by half since the ban was introduced, end quote. Although while countries surrounding Sweden have had significant increase in trafficking, the Swedish model for combating human trafficking has received praise for its effectivity in ending sex slavery. My next point, as well as my previous claims referencing Scandinavian policy, can be found at humanrightslawyers.eu. The criticism this policy has received is that it's not as effective as it could be because law enforcement isn't as strict with charging buyers as they could be, giving leniency to predators, which plain and simple means, should the policy be used properly by police officers, trafficking would be even lower than the current reduction of half, and the potentiality of zero trafficking. Again, the cost must outweigh the risk. With this data available, it is undeniable that we can at least cut trafficking in half if we partner with law enforcement and use the law correctly. We have an opportunity to eliminate sex trafficking altogether. Several countries have followed Sweden's approach. Norway and Iceland passed similar laws in 2007 and 2008. In 2014, North Ireland became the first country in the UK to pass similar laws. In 2014, Canada adopted a law in the spirit of the Nordic model. In 2014, the Parliaments of European Union and the Council of Europe both adopted non-binding resolution recommending member states to consider the Nordic model. In 2016, France voted to criminalize the purchase of sex, equalitynow.org. Ireland has adopted the Nordic model as well, nordicmodelnow.org. The Nordic model is the Swedish approach which offers victims programs and services to help them exodus cry. Victims and their communities will no longer be pacified with misdemeanor charges. By passing the legislation, we will be sending a message loud and clear that the abuser's time is up. We will not tolerate the abuse occurred by victims. When you look at the effects of PTSD on the victims, you will see that they are lifelong issues the victim has to learn to manage. The unfortunate and outrageous reality is that victims are paying the highest price, while the men who fuel this horrific, illegal, modern-day slavery are not held accountable for the pain and suffering they inflict and continue to fuel. If our current policies change to replicate effective policies such as the Swedish Nordic model that are tried and true to diminish trafficking, we can have the same effect and protect the citizens of Idaho. My brother and sister survivors who have been tortured by buyers carry not just the emotional and mental scars I do, but they carry the physical scars. When they look in the mirror or at their bodies, it's a daily reminder that someone thought the law did not apply to them, and that this human being was an object of their sick and twisted desire. The buyer had no regard for the life they mutilated and exploited. Can you please hand me some water? Thank you. There are buyers in every socioeconomic class. and the difference between right and wrong, and they know the difference between right and wrong. They feed on everything to do with purchasing a human being for sex. They feed on breaking the law. They feed on the pain. They feed on the secrecy. They feed on the hunt. They feed on the paying for another human being's life. I could go on. Some of the stories I've heard from fellow survivors, as well as my own experiences, well up a great sense of righteous indignation. It should do the same to you. Knowing the policy the Scandinavians have put into place, having cut trafficking in half, I and every other survivor, every other Idahoan, will not be satisfied until policy is to follow their lead. This will continue to come before you until it is passed, as greater evidence grows from this policy overseas and more survivors from trafficking in the state of Idaho and data become available. To further explain the devastation of sex trafficking, also known as prostitution, a study of 854 women in prostitution concluded that 60 to 75% of them were raped, 70 to 95% were physically assaulted, and 68% met the criteria for PTSD in the same range as treatment-seeking combat veterans and victims of state-organized torture. Exodus cry. We will no longer be pacified by buyers' pathetic and petty excuses to engage in devastating behavior, some even portraying themselves as victims of some sort due to their unwillingness to pour their time, energy, and money into relationships far more fulfilling than exploiting our vulnerable. We will no longer be pacified that we're unsure how to go about effective policy to end human trafficking. We will no longer be pacified with policies that are ineffective when we have the data to back this legislator you will be voting on. I have experienced the PTSD and effects of exploitation myself. I have been exploited by men right here in the valley who pretend to care for me, all the while setting traps for me to live and remain a slave to their pervasive desires. Never once did they help me without holding it above my head, owing them something, threatening my life, and threatening my family's lives. Representative Cheney, I understand that you feel like maybe they would be less willing to prosecute if a felony offense was the first time charge. What we need to do is we really need to educate our law enforcement on how to properly identify trafficking. It's often misidentified, and that's the number one, not opposition, but that's one of the barriers that goes against how we can effectively eradicate this situation. I personally called law enforcement on a situation, and they practically laughed in my face. I don't think that was intentional. I think that was due to an uneducated officer. Representative McDonald, effectivity by law enforcement and courts was your question. Was that correct, Mr. Chairman?
It's not, you yield to a question, Representative McDonald?
Yes, I will.
I want to make sure that I understand the question that you had previously stated, which was, if I understand correctly, what's the effectivity by law enforcement and courts?
That's correct.
Okay.
I think that one of the number one things that we need to do in order to eradicate human trafficking in the state of Idaho, not just nationwide, but definitely start here, is education for law enforcement, for prosecutors, for judges, everybody involved in this situation. We really need to educate them so they completely understand how trafficking rings operate and work. Because my personal experience is that it's unbelievable how they work, and they don't even have to lay a harmful finger on you. To clarify, Representative Zollinger, how do I say your name, sir?
Well, at this point,
Sorry.
it's not really in order to question the panel here, but you're
Right.
welcome to
Okay.
comment on ideas that may have been capsuled in the questions.
Okay. So it's been my experience that prosecution has well, okay, maybe my opinion, that prosecution is less willing to acknowledge that we have a trafficking problem here in Idaho because maybe some of the stats aren't available, but I can tell you from my personal experience, it's alive and well here. And it's not just children, it's adults too, and it's not just women, it's men as well. I think one of the questions had been, why does Idaho have a C currently? And one of the reasons why Idaho still receives a C on the grading scale that Shared Hope International offers is that a child can still be charged with prostitution, which really doesn't make any sense because a child cannot be give consent to be a willing participant in sex, so therefore, why would prostitution apply? There was a question, it's just talking about how we need to educate law enforcement. And so really that's my stance, is that we really need to educate law enforcement and everybody involved, and that in order to end the demand, we have to give harsher consequences for buyers. And I think that my testimony has addressed that.
Thank you. Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a motion.
I think you're a little premature for a motion at this point. There's a couple more people to testify. But thank you. We got 1, 2, 3 more here, so we'll try and get them done. Tierra Roper.
Hello, Chairman. Hello, everyone else.
Welcome to the committee. And if you could just please state your name for the
My
record
name
and
is-
not be too nervous, because we want to hear what you have to say.
Well, my name is Tierra Roper. My birth name is Shannon Bowman. I thank all of you for being here today and listening to everyone. And whatever the ruling is, I will respect it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a wife of a retired military man of 22 years who is standing beside me. His name is Stephen Roper. I'm the mother of 3 beautiful children and a college graduate. I'm a friend, I'm a niece, and I'm a lady. I am also a victim and a survivor. I'm here today because passing me on the street or meeting me at church and others, you would not know I ever had been traded or sold unless I told you. A human being that has been sold could look like anyone, just like me. I'm a survivor of child porn, sex trade, child molestation, and torture. What happened to me was long ago, but remains with me always. The physical and emotional scars are always there. They never go away. My case was sealed in Arizona in 1987. There wasn't loss for me. The buyers. There was only loss for the seller. And to keep me safe, my name later was changed. The case itself started when I was 6.5 years old. Around 1984 and 85, my biological father was convicted. In 1987, he got 18 years to life. However, everyone that bought me, everyone that they indicted, went free. All the sellers went free and still sell. But there were no laws what was done to me back then, so he was convicted on the highest charges possible. 3 counts of child molestation and 2 counts of attempted murder. I thank Jesus every day I'm alive. But the same cannot be said of others who suffer or have suffered at the hands of others who sell humans as a commodity, entertainment, or trade for drugs. My first memory of being sold and touched was when I was 4 years old. I suffered from Ptsd. I was handed off to a biker from a well-known LA gang. My flesh and another's were traded for drugs. I'm sorry. My flesh, I was only 4, first touched, forced to watch another woman of 25 be violently raped. She was taken.
and others who were from Mexico, taken over the border and raped. I was given to others for payment of drugs, debts by my own biological father. One time I was made to sleep with a 65-year-old woman for payment for growing marijuana. I was also given to others to crawl naked on the floor for entertainment, paid for by other men. When I did not do what I was traded or sold for, I was tortured by my father. Sometimes a gun with one bullet was put into my mouth and triggered 3 times. I was pulled, ordered time and time again to obey. Other times, boiling hot water was poured down my body. I have had over 14 surgeries to correct what was done to me. I am 39 now. I was moved around a lot and only remained in places for a few years at a time. There were often other children I watched beside me that were traded, that were beaten, until they could not move or taken to other rooms where they could not be seen, but their screams could be heard. I'm here to be the voice of those that have died at the hands of the buyers, who can't be here today to talk. This is not just a small amount what was done to me. I was made to watch the memories I live with, the nightmares, and sometimes keeps me awake at night. Being sold to another should never be allowed, and someone who buys another doesn't need 3 chances to do what was done to me. The first time should be the last time. Let Idaho stand for the change in law so that victims have a chance to be survivors, so they can live a good life and be a survivor like me, who has a good husband, beautiful children. I am thankful that I'm able to share this with you today, all of you. And I thank God for his strength and hope and healing. And I thank you all.
Thank you for coming. I know that was not easy, and we appreciate you being here.
Yeah, my name has been changed. The state of Arizona, I had some elected representatives that were amazing, and they stood and they helped me to overcome what was done to me. And I'm hoping you all, since now I am an Idahoan, will stand and help others like what was done to me, so that the buyer can be taken up and the victim become a survivor. I would appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If there's any questions, I
Don't see any. Thank you.
okay, thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Tom Arkush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak. I'm here on behalf of the Idaho criminal defense lawyers, and obviously...
And if you could state your name, please.
Pardon me?
If you could state your name, please.
Oh, Tom Arkush. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, we abhor, everybody in this room abhors human trafficking, whether of sex workers or manual workers. But for that reason, and the resources this bill is crying for, as a first step, Representative Cheney, we disagree with this bill and we adamantly oppose this bill. If I understand the goal of this bill and the thinking, it is that a harsh punishment will prevent illicit sex, which will decrease demand for victims, which will put an end to trafficking. Then the question becomes, will making solicitation a felony stem illicit sex? Ladies and gentlemen, this has a biblical dimension. I mean, God tried that social engineering with Adam and Eve, and it did not work. And it doesn't work in Idaho. We have L&L statutes, kidnap statutes. It's a felony to procure. It's a felony to run a house of prostitution. Every story I've heard from these brave women that came and testified here today would has a statute that would result in a life sentence if the person was arrested and prosecuted, and yet it goes on. What then will work? I have a suggestion for the panel, and I think we first have to identify who are the victims of human trafficking and focus on these potential victims before they become victims. And what I'm telling you today is something my wife, who's an RN and a volunteer parish nurse, told me because part of her job is to study and learn about and try to identify victims before they become victims. Those vulnerable to become enslaved workers are people who frequent food banks, the homeless, addicts. They are induced into circumstances of living, creating debt, perhaps addiction, and they're trapped. Similarly, those vulnerable to become sex workers are truants, substance abusers, people involved in criminal activity, young people, runaways. And so how do we identify these folks? Well, I would suggest to this panel that rather than create another felony and put people in the Idaho State Penitentiary between $22,000 and $27,000 a year, that if we have that money, to devote that money to giving the police resources in our schools, and resources for recovery programs. We have fewer recovery beds, it is my understanding, in this state than most states do. The problem is not a criminal problem with social aspects, it's a social problem with criminal aspects. And I would suggest to this panel, because the Criminal Justice Commission is currently talking about this and is a funnel for all of the assets in the state to be helpful, that the matter be referred to them and allow them to continue to study and continue to decide what resources and how those resources be devoted. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak. I'll stand for any questions.
Questions of Mr. Arkush? Representative McCrosty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Arkush, some of the victims that have spoken earlier today have stated that that the change of this law would not change behavior. And a couple of times the request was to enact this legislation to end the demand. And so my question for you, and you may or may not know this, and feel free to hypothesize or not, but the question is, do you believe that the proposed changes would change behavior, or if they would end the demand?
Mr. Arkush.
Mr. Chairman, Representative McCluskey, because we have on the books today felonies for this behavior, especially L&Ls, that have life sentences attached, and our sentencing judges in this state, Representative Perry, you're right, they're very serious about sentencing when somebody's convicted, and we continue to have that behavior occur. I don't think it's going to change the procurer's behavior. I think that what we have to do is protect young people especially before they become victims, and we need to be able to very early on identify who they are, and if they do become victims, we have to have recovery beds in place and means to help them. This Inside Out sounds like a wonderful organization.
Thank you. Don't see any other
Thank you,
questions, Mr. Arkush. Don Maglish. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Luker. My name is Dawn Maglish. I'm the founder of Inside Out. I noticed my name got thrown around a lot today. Honestly, I didn't write anything up. I just wanted to answer questions. I've made it my life's work. I heard about human trafficking a long time ago. I've seen it overseas. The reason I founded Inside Out to work specifically in Idaho because there were no resources or work being done specifically for victims of human trafficking. And the reason I chose to work with juveniles is to give our state a chance. These kids didn't have places to go. Doesn't mean we don't work with adult survivors. We do. There are adult survivors, and one of the things I wanted to distinguish for you is prostitution and human trafficking go hand in hand. What you're trying to define right now is the willingness behind it. Just because I accept money for something doesn't mean I want to be tortured in the process. I also am a hairdresser. So I also understand the service industry very well. Prostitution is not a legal service. I've heard it over and over. People say, oh, prostitution's illegal in our state. Prostitution's are illegal in our states. I have been through our repositories. There are not Johns very well arrested in the state of Idaho. Why? Well, I also work in the court system on juvenile drug court in a county in our state. I go with our victims to courts. If a prosecutor can get a felony charge on somebody over a misdemeanor, they're going after the felony charge. And like prosecutional discretion or whatever, I've been in courts where the judge makes the decision to do a harsher sentence. This is where the boundaries start, right? We can work with inside really good boundaries. Legislation is to create a safe environment for our state with the response to our community. People will do whatever they can. If I don't want to wear my seatbelt, I'm going to get punished, right? We have a law that says I'm going to pay for that. Why shouldn't these people pay? That's a human life, regardless if that person was willing or not. So what we're saying is it's okay. It's a misdemeanor. It's all right. Slap on the wrist. I know. I work in a salon, so I've heard many, many stories. I've had women coming in and telling me the heartbreak of their man soliciting a prostitute, married with children, soliciting a prostitute. Do you want me to tell you how that affects the family? This is wrong. What Representative Crane is talking about is for the people. Talk to your constituents. Ask them what they think of this. I guarantee they're going to be like, this is out of control. This should have been a felony first time. I don't understand why it's a misdemeanor. I, 3 years ago, looked at this statute and thought to myself, why has prostitution not been looked at in our state since 1994 at least? Prostitution is a nice way to say feeding into human trafficking. No buyer sits at home and says, I'm going to go out and buy someone today. I need to get my kicks. No, they don't. It starts with pornography, and it's baby steps. When I've bought a prostitute for the first time and that's not enough, what am I going to do? Children, have you talked to these perpetrators? Have you talked to the buyers? I have. Talk to them. Ask them what's going to make a difference in their life. I guarantee I'm not going to pay the penalty for something if I know the consequences. There are always going to be bad people in our world, but our job as a state is to protect the citizens. And less people will be prostituting themselves or being engaged in that if we create a safer environment for them. I sent some statistics out. You can go to the website Demand Abolition. It has lots of statistics on the buying in our states, in the United States. 1%, they say, let me pull it up here, 1% of buyers who reported buying sex in a Canadian study indicated that they were ever arrested for prostitution. I work with detectives, I work with the FBI, I work with Homeland Security. I will tell you, when they find victims, where are the buyers? I guarantee you, when I took a 16-year-old girl 2 years ago, because a detective called me to get her to start testifying and help her through this, she was found in a local Treasure Valley hotel room with 3 older men. 1 the seller, 2 got let go. Why? It's a misdemeanor. Slap on the wrist, walk away. We don't want to ruin his family. We don't want to do this. Well, guess whose families are being ruined? I think you've heard from these women. That's why they're here. Doesn't matter if it's a juvenile or an adult. The damage is lifelong for the families, the adults, and the men. And to tell you that I don't care about the men would be a lie. I care. I care about the men in this room. I care about the women in this room. And that we would degrade ourselves to buying sexual acts is immoral. And that's what Representative Crane was trying to say. It's an immorality. And we're perpetuating that as a culture. So at what point are we going to say no? We're not going to take it anymore. That's what this law is about. Yeah, there's technicalities and stuff, but when are we going to start making a difference?